Hello everyone, my name is Eddie Smith from Midwestern Marx, and this is your step-by-step guide to understanding Marx. Probably the most common question I get is, what should I read? What should I start reading in order to get an understanding of Marx's theory? So I wanted to create a step-by-step guide so people can know if I read these series of books in this order, I will have at least a rough understanding of Marx's theories. And everyone sort of wants their hand held when it comes to reading theory, right? Everybody wants to understand what's in the books of theory. Nobody wants to take the hours of time and mental labor to actually read the books so you can have a thorough understanding of what's in them. And I understand that, which is why I wanted to create this step-by-step guide, and it's why I do reading guides summarizing works of theory. But at the end of the day, if you want a thorough understanding of Marxism and you want to be confident in your understanding of Marxism and be able to speak about it confidently, you're going to have to read the books and you're going to have to take your time reading the books. You can't rush through them or read into them, which is going to take some patience, but we got time, you know? Capitalism's been around for a while and it looks like it's not going away. So you might as well start learning how it works and how to destroy it in your free time, and that's what Marxism is for. Now, my list is going to be very personalized, right? I started off studying politics in college and getting an understanding of geopolitics, global politics, things like imperialism. It was after that that I found Marxism and learned that it provides a lens of analysis that explain a lot of the awful things that we see. Things made a lot more sense when I learned that the wars that were happening were for capitalist expansion. So this is a personalized list. If you want to check out another list, check out the step-by-step guide from Azure Scapegoat, another great socialist YouTuber. There may be a little overlap between his list and mine, but probably not too much. But his video and mine both break Marxism down into three components: historical, philosophical, and economic or political. So without further ado, let's jump right into the list. This is Eddie Liger's step-by-step guide to being a Marx understander. My first book is The Divide by Jason Hickel. Now, it may be a little controversial to put a non-Marxist text as the first book that you need to read in order to understand Marxism. But like I said, this is a personalized list for me, and this was one of the very first books I read when I started studying global politics. This book details a very important concept and a historical fact that's often hidden from Americans, and that is how the West gained such disproportionate wealth to the global South. In the US, we're often sold the idea of American exceptionalism. The West is just better, and capitalism is the best economic system ever created. There are also racist arguments that are used to explain the wealth gap between global North and global South. However, in reality, the global South has been held in poverty and exploited by the West for the enrichment of the West. The Western capitalist countries in North America and Europe did not grow so rich alongside of the global South, who simply didn't grow as quickly. The global North grew at the expense of the global South. This is a very important concept for Westerners to understand, and I think it will give you a good perspective of the current global economic situation and the history behind it before you go into actually reading Marx and the critiques of capitalism that he laid out in the 19th century. The Divide is probably not a necessary text if you're someone who already sort of understands the current global situation or who understands the crimes of the Western world and of Western imperialism. But if you're not, this book will give you all the basics, so that's why it's my first recommendation. And my number 2 book for understanding the philosophical side of Marxism, also known as dialectical materialism, we have On Contradiction by Mao Zedong. This is a book that's recommended by a lot of well-read Marxists. And it's a little bit scary to recommend to Americans because they have a lot of preconceived notions about Mao, but even if you think that Mao was a mass murderer and a horrible leader, this is still a really good book. What this book is going to help you do is understand dialectical materialism, Marx's theory for how history moves. Marx would expand on the philosophy of dialectics, but it originated with the German philosopher George Hegel. Now, Hegel wrote incredibly confusingly. His books are very hard to understand, and there are people out there who will say you need to read Hegel before you actually read Marx. Probably people who are more concerned with the academic side of Marxism than in actually advancing the class struggle, but those people do exist, and I will say reading Hegel and understanding dialectical materialism will help you understand Marx. But On Contradiction by Mao Zedong was written for the Chinese peasants, meaning he tried to make dialectical materialism as understandable as possible, which makes this book a great introductory text for understanding dialectical materialism. Another very simple book that can serve this purpose, also written by an author who will scare many Westerners, Dialectical and Historical Materialism by Joseph Stalin. Now, I prefer On Contradiction as I feel Stalin's book simplifies dialectics to the point of actually being a little bit wrong. But Stalin's book, for me personally, was one of the books that first helped me understand dialectics in a very basic sense, and I could later expand and refine my knowledge by reading other texts. So, On Contradiction or Dialectical and Historical Materialism. Pick them up, give them a read, and give yourself an introduction to dialectical materialism. Number three, we are going to look at the application of dialectical materialism as a philosophy to the field of sociology. That being the origins of private property, the family, and the state by Friedrich Engels. In this book, Engels takes the anthropological, scientific, and historical records that were available to him at the time, and he traces the changes and evolutions in human society that resulted in the emergence of the family, private property, and the state. For one, this is one of the most entertaining books that Marx or Engels ever wrote. Secondly, it helps explain how certain phenomena arose in society historically, meaning they didn't always exist, even if those phenomena are things that we grow up seeing and we assume they're just a part of society. For example, the state. We all know that we have a government, but do we all know how it came to be historically? Or the male dominated family and the patriarchy, which didn't even exist when humans had communal families, as ancestry would be traced through the mother. Understanding that society has been in flux from the beginning, constantly moving, evolving, and changing and creating new phenomena, will really help you understand Marx and will help you understand that he is saying the current formulation of society that we're living in is not the final formulation. That society is still in flux, evolving, and changing, and eventually we will move beyond the current mode of production that is capitalism. Number four, we have wage, labor, and capital combined with value, price, and profit by the man himself, the first time he's in this list, Karl Marx. So I've given you a philosophy text, I've given you a history text, and now I'm giving you an economic text. As I said, these are the three components of Marxism that make up the whole of his philosophy. Wage, labor, and capital, or value, price, and profit, are sort of ultra simplified versions of the book Capital. Now, capital is enormous and it makes a lot of different arguments, whereas wage, labor, and capital and value, price, and profit are both very small. These books basically lay out the economic terms that Marx defines in capital. Things like variable capital, constant capital, surplus value, this terminology that gets confusing for people who have never gotten around to opening books of theory. For me, I actually read Capital before Wage, Labor, and Capital, but after dragging myself through the 1,000-page beast that is Capital Volume 1, I picked up Wage, Labor, and Capital, or Value, Price, and Profit, and it reinforced a lot of the knowledge that I had gained from reading Capital. So it's a really good supplement to your reading of that book, and it's just also a really good intro text for understanding the basic economic terms that Marx is going to use all the time. And number five, sticking with the man himself, Karl Marx, we have the OG, the classic Communist Manifesto. This book actually isn't the OG, it's just become the most famous, probably because it's basically a motivational book for workers at the time, urging them to unite. They have nothing to lose but their chains. Seize the means of production. Do it now. You rah rah. Marx is filled with moral fervor in this book, which makes it easy for Western academics to hold it up and say, look how crazy Karl Marx was. He didn't actually have any brilliant philosophy or contributions to political economy. He was just some crazy guy urging the workers to seize the world. But the only reason Marx talks like that in this book is because this was meant to be a party program for the communists at the time. This is what we want to do as communists. Now, obviously, there's a lot of differences between what was going on in the 1800s and what's going on now, but there's still a lot of stuff this book can teach us. All three components of Marxist philosophy are talked about in here, and I like it the most because it shows that Marx wasn't an armchair academic. He wanted real societal change. He wanted to solve the contradictions of capitalism, and he was urging workers, the proletariat, to do just that. He was a genius and scientific philosopher, but he did approach things from a moral perspective. And the Communist Manifesto highlights both those things really well. Number six, we have the famous State and Revolution by Vladimir Lenin. Lenin obviously led the Russian Revolution in October 1917, which created the Soviet Union, the world's first socialist experiment. Now, if you read this book today, and I have a full reading guide and summary of it up on my YouTube channel, you may be a little confused, like, really? We're gonna seize the US government? What, are we just gonna march on the Capitol and take it over? Is that really what Lenin is arguing here for? And I would say no, obviously things have changed and we need a different approach to seizing state power, but Lenin proves in this book that seizing state power is still necessary. If you've done the other readings in the reading guide, you will know that the current system is built off the exploitation of the masses of society, and that the global south is being held in poverty through tactics of imperialism that kill millions of people. Once you understand that, Lenin's idea of seizing state power makes a lot more sense, especially when you look at it from the perspective of countries in the global south. These countries are going to need a state apparatus or a military to defend themselves when the United States tries to invade them for going socialist. And if we were ever to make a real push for socialism and advanced class struggle in the United States, the armed bodies of the state, the CIA, FBI, military, whoever else, would start killing us. And therefore, state power is necessary to protect the revolution. This is part of what Lenin lays out in this book, as well as much more. And while this book is outdated in a few parts, it's still probably the best book for understanding the state and Marxist views of the state. And it's also a great reference text for what Marx and Engels said about the state, as Lenin basically goes through and cites everything they ever said about the state, including in letters that they wrote or pamphlets that were never published. So yes, a must read even if you don't consider yourself a Marxist-Leninist. All right, once you finish State and Revolution, you're going to turn to number 8, Reformer Revolution by Rosa Luxemburg. So Lenin's explained how the state works, explained the need to seize state power, but maybe you're still a little nervous. Why the need for revolution, you might ask? Can't we just give people Medicare for all, healthcare, social democracy, Bernie-style policies? Well, capitalist countries have been trying to implement social democratic policies for years, and they are often undone by the capitalists. Workers have organized into unions right here in the United States and fought for better wages, better benefits, better working hours. Those unions have been decimated by right-to-work laws, by the state, by the government, which in the US is owned by the capitalists. Here you see the need for revolution, the need to not ask for state power, but to take state power from the exploiters, the imperialists, and the capitalists. Reforms in countries like the US that make life better for workers don't do anything about the rampant imperialism and the killing of millions of people in the global south so that their resources can be extracted. Workers, or so-called Marxists in the global north who want to continue imperialism while raising the standard of living for workers, are what Luxemburg calls in this book and Lenin in another book, opportunists. Opportunism hurts the revolution and it gives people wrong ideas of how to abolish capitalism. So yeah, Reformer Revolution by Luxemburg, the best book on why you shouldn't be a social democrat. Number 8, our second to last one here, we're going back to our boy Freddie Engels with Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. In this book, Engels talks about the development of philosophy, especially in Europe, leading up to Marx. People like Robert Owen, who was a philanthropist who attempted to build his own sort of socialist society where his workers could live better, as well as covering Enlightenment era thinkers who made popular these ideals like justice, democracy, secularism. And in Utopian and Scientific, Engels has a lot of praise for these people, but he does think they are utopian, whereas what Marx adds is science, the scientific analysis of capitalism. Without understanding dialectics and the interpenetration of opposites, and then without making an analysis of capitalism as a system in its totality, meaning understanding the contradictory forces within capitalism, the capitalists and the proletariat, you can't understand how to abolish capitalism, which is through advancing class struggle and advancing the struggle of the proletariat, which can lead us to socialism. Marx adding this and Marx's analysis of capitalism is what we call making socialism scientific. Rather than trying to create communist or socialist societies where everybody lives in this sort of imagined utopia, we look at the history of class struggles till now and the classes who presently exist and how the struggle of those classes can lead us to the next society, and we can get a real scientific idea of how to achieve and build socialism. The book also covers a lot of capitalism's development in Europe as it became industry rather than small manufacturing shops and guilds, which is also really interesting and good stuff to know. Similar to Origins of Private Property, it shows you kind of how historical materialism works as a lens for analyzing history and the world around us. And number 9, the last book on our list here, and my favorite book of all time, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Vladimir Lenin. Now, we know that capitalism is a system that grows and changes. This is what Marx said. In Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, Engels talks about how philosophers looking at the economic system in the 16th or 1700s couldn't have come to the same conclusions as Marx because the system was not as developed as it would be when Marx analyzed the system. And the most important development in the capitalist mode of production post Marx has been the monopolization of capital and the move to imperialism. Once capitalists monopolize markets in their home countries, they have gone abroad and they have used the state apparatus and the armed bodies of the state, like the military, to overthrow other countries so they can control markets, natural resources, and labor. Now, Marx predicted that as capitalism grew, the productive forces of every country would increase to a certain point, and the working class would eventually overthrow the ruling class and we'd move to socialism. However, what's happened, and Marx sort of started to observe this towards the end of his life, was imperialism held the productive forces of countries and stopped them from increasing. For example, Venezuela, the country that Western media told us is a socialist failure. For the entire 20th century, Rockefeller Standard Oil and British Dutch Shell were extracting oil from Venezuela. This meant that their productive forces were only advanced in the oil industry and all other industries lagged behind. You saw a similar phenomenon in Cuba with the sugar and tobacco plantations becoming the only crop that could be planted. Then, of course, when these countries look to take control of their means of production and increase their country's productive forces in all the important industries that produce necessary goods for the working masses, the US overthrows them or puts them under economic embargo or does coups, all of which you've seen in Venezuela and attempted in Cuba. Understanding this is so important because it shows us as socialists one of our main enemies is imperialism. For years, capitalist imperialism, and since World War II, mostly the United States, have held down the advancement and the class struggle of the international working class. And as socialists, especially if we live in the United States, the imperial core, in order to advance the cause of socialism, we need to fight imperialism. And Lenin's imperialism will help you understand it and then fight it. So that's my list, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. Of course, I am not suggesting that this is the only list or that this is the exact path you need to follow. Use this list however you want. Take out specific books from it if they have concepts that you're not sure about yet. If you think my list is wrong, go ahead and tell me it's wrong. If you have your own list, please list it in the comments. That would be very, very cool to read. And that's it. I hope this was helpful. Please check out my reading guides and summaries of imperialism and state and revolution. More of those coming soon. And thanks for watching as always. Solidarity. I'm Eddie Smith, and this is Midwestern Marx.